Welcome everybody to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James. And so today we're talking about this book by Takahiro Yamamoto. Your first book, I think you said, Demarcating Japan. And I think it's going to be an interesting talk because we're, there is this tendency to regard Japan as quite a homogeneous society and a clearly defined country, particularly by the Japanese themselves, I think. But obviously, Japan, in its history, has had slightly porous borders at the edges, and places like Hokkaido and Okinawa have by no means been clearly part of Japan for the whole of their history. So I think that's what we're going to be talking about. So let me just briefly introduce our speaker. He is Assistant Professor of Cultural Economic History at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies, Ruprecht Karls Universität Heidelberg. And his specialism is in history of modern Japan. And although it's his first book, he's published an edited book and journal articles and so forth. And he's had a very international career. So having started at Tokyo University, he was at Tufts in the US. His PhD was from LSE here in London. He's been a postdoc in Shanghai as well as at the University of Tokyo. And now, as I mentioned, he's in Heidelberg. So he, as you might imagine, focuses on Japan's international connections in particular. So without any further ado, I will pass over to him to tell us about his book.
Okay. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I would like to thank the wonderful team of the Daiwa Foundation for making this happen. I'm really happy that I'm able to stand on this side of the podium. Last time I remember I was on the other side as an audience, being a PhD student at LSE about a decade ago. So it's really a happy moment for me to be able to come here today. Okay, in the 40 minutes or so that I have, I would like to do two things. First, I will give you the overview of the book. And second, I would like to look into one chapter to give you a sense of how I approach this topic. I've done a talk that rushes through all chapters, but I think this is actually a better approach and it's going to be more enjoyable because I get to speak about a little bit more specific details of the book. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about the other part of the book if you're so interested. So this is the book about border history of 19th century Japan that asks how the territorial limits of modern Japan emerged. Until the mid-19th century, as many of you probably would imagine, it was not really a priority of the Tokugawa shogunate to determine the geographic limits of its power, a tendency not entirely surprising if one considers its policy of relegating foreign relations to local agents on the fringe. But by the 1880s, there was a series of international negotiations that determined the limits of Japan's territorial control. And this doesn't mean that everybody accepted the resulting shape of Japan, but one could argue at least that there was such a thing as Japanese territory by that point. This, of course, is complicated by the fact that Japan is surrounded by the seawater, but that's something we'll deal with later. We can identify two pre-existing modalities of governing border regions in early 19th century East Asia and the Northwestern Pacific at the nexus of which I see Japan being located. East Asia, so one is the tribute trade and the other is resource extraction by indigenous labor. The prime example for the former is the Ryukyu Kingdom, today's Okinawa, which paid tax to the Satsuma domain, today's Kagoshima, but also sent tributes to China, specifically to Fuzhou in South China, and received lavish gifts in return. This arrangement was widely observed in China's foreign relations, where economic exchange was choreographed as an acknowledgement of hierarchy, essentially the supremacy of the Chinese emperor. The second kind, resource extraction, was exercised in sparsely populated areas in Siberia, Manchuria, today's Hokkaido, Alaska, and so on. The level of coercion and economic subjugation differed from one region to another, but they were all commonly focused on forcing indigenous residents to collect natural resources, most notably animal furs. The extractors had little interest in governing the space, and unlike the cases of the tribute trade, they showed little benevolence towards the people they subjugated. The furs were given up in exchange for meager supplies and wages, removing the indigenous peoples from other forms of production, such as agriculture, and often condemning them into deep financial debt. So, departure from these two forms of governance to that of a modern territorial state is the story of the mid to late 19th century Japan that I discuss in this book. To explain why this process took place the way it did around the Japanese archipelago, I put forward two arguments. One is to say that Japan ended up in possession of most of the remote islands that were in question in the late 19th century, not just because of its expansionist ideologies and its diplomatic savvy, but also, more crucially, because of the multilateral balance that prevented other empires from investing political and military resources. What I call extra Asian powers in the book, principally Britain, US, and Russia, to a lesser extent France and Germany, all came into maritime East Asia with a different set of ideas about governing space. Their principle demanded that any piece of land above seawater needed to be a territory of one state. But the belonging of islands, which in theory could be accessed by anyone sailing from how far away they may be, it was an open question. There was this openness of the sea that made things a little more complicated than a binary relations of a space between two states. This openness of maritime space forced people to consider multilateral relations rather than the bilateral ones. The question for the officials dealing with this would then be, how do you achieve the best political outcome without overstretching your state resources? In most places, the extra-Asian powers acquiesced to the Japanese control of the islands as they saw a better outcome than one of their rivals taking control. The quote here is the British Foreign Secretary and its minister in Japan talking about the Bonin Islands, the Ogasawara Islands. The second argument is that the transformation of border regions was connected with each other through the movements of local individuals, many of whom were not working for any government. When we talk about the territorial demarcation, we usually talk about diplomats and politicians, and this, of course, is important. But my point is that they were often responding to the crossings, connections, and conflicts created by non-state actors and in the border regions. And crucially, they were moving between these border regions, often bypassing the political center. Border demarcation, in this sense, can be conceived slightly more broadly than defining the spatial limits of a state. It could also be about regulating people's movements across the border regions. As we will see later, in the 1880s, the Meiji state tried to eliminate unauthorized movements in the border regions so that there would be some coherence between the territorial status of islands and how people moved about. This process was obviously incomplete. The Japanese government never completely eradicated the kind of movements that they didn't see as legal, but the pretense that the central government in Tokyo is now in charge was something new, and this epitomized the changes that took place around the late 19th century Japan. The book has 5 chapters, each focusing on one region around the Japanese archipelago: Tsushima, Ryukyu Islands, Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and the Bonin Islands, Ogasawara Islands, as it's called today. Each chapter starts with how the early modern arrangement worked, conditioned by various local political and economic circumstances. And the latter half of each chapter narrates the story of a few individuals who might be called the agents of this process of demarcation. So if you read through the book from the beginning to the end, you will go from early modern to modern 5 times. I did think about having a simpler structure but I think this is an easier to handle, especially in the context of university, where if you were thinking about assigning part of the book to the students. So that was my decision. So that's really the basic premise of the book. And as I say, I'm happy to talk about any aspect of it. But for the rest of my time, I'd like to focus on chapter 4, which deals with the Kuril Islands between the Kamchatka Peninsula and Hokkaido. And the chapter is titled, "And Then There Were None," after Agatha Christie's novel. And I don't deal with mysterious murders, but I do deal with islands and disappearances. I discuss the disappearances of settlers, indigenous peoples, and marine animals. The incorporation of these islands into the Japanese state and the Meiji state's reconfiguration of human mobility thereafter deprived the archipelago of warm bodies. The Kuril Islands are no tiny speck of rocks. The largest island, Etorofu or Itrup, is more than twice as large as Okinawa. But the population was always small, numbering in hundreds or at most a few thousand. The indigenous Ainu people are believed to have moved there from Hokkaido by the 17th century. Their lives centered on animal hunting and traveling between the islets in canoes, sometimes for years before returning to their home village. The Ainu traded furs with the Russian Cossacks, who imposed a trade agreement to demonstrate to the Tsar that they had subjugated these peoples. By the mid-19th century, the Kuril Ainu clustered in villages on 3 islands in the northern part of the archipelago, but they remained highly mobile. In 1855, when Japan and Russia signed their first bilateral treaty, they agreed that the islands up to Itrup would belong to Japan, and the rest of the archipelago to the northeast would belong to Russia. In 1875, Japan and Russia signed another treaty, Treaty of St. Petersburg, under which the two countries, quote unquote, swapped the islands. Sakhalin becomes the Russian, and the Kuril Islands, in its entirety, becomes the Japanese possession. That's the most basic, I would say, textbook timeline that we're dealing with here. Up to Itrup, small Japanese fishing villages existed, but for the rest, the residents were the Ainu, a handful of agents of the Russian-American company, Russia's state-backed enterprise dealing with fur hunting, for animal hunting, and indigenous hunters that they brought in from various parts of Russian America. Access to the Kurils by sea was extremely difficult. Floating ice blocked the route in the winter, and fog complicated summer voyages. In short, this was no easy place to live or govern, hence the small population. Let me now go through the 3 disappearances, starting with the settlers. In order to explain why the Russian agents left the Kuril Islands, we have to talk about Alaska. On the 30th of March, 1867, Russia sold its colonial possession in North America to the United States, which would then become the state of Alaska eventually. Kuril Islands remained under the Russian sovereignty, and the governing body, the Russian-American company, ISC, was liquidated. So the island chain was left in a state of political vacuum. Immediately after the ISC's liquidation, American businesses on the US West Coast formed a cartel in marine animal hunting on the North Pacific coast. By mid-March 1868, the Russian assets found their way to a small number of American traders named Hutchison Coal & Company, based in San Francisco, and a few more mergers resulted in the creation of Alaska Commercial Company in October the same year. Between 1870 and 1890, the ACC, Alaska Commercial Company, enjoyed the exclusive lease of the Pribilof Islands, the largest hunting ground in Alaska, with the annual quota of 100,000 seals. The Aleuts, the indigenous peoples, and settler workers, wholly supplied and forcibly employed, clubbed tens of thousands of fur seals and ACC took all of the furs. The ACC's monopoly in Alaska was a source of animosity on the part of the rival companies. The rival companies accused the ACC of exploiting indigenous labor and lobbied for political intervention from Washington. This led to a total of 4 congressional investigations into the lease, but it was never overturned until it expired in 1890. Frustrated, other hunters looked for alternatives. One of the places they found was the Kuril Islands, which was, following the liquidation of the Russian-American company, practically ungoverned. The RSC had given the business to a Russian merchant based in Petropavlovsk in Kamchatka Peninsula, and he had placed a few agents in the Kurils, but no Russian state officials were in sight. In 1872, the American vessel wandered into the southern Kurils and had fortuitous success in hunting around 200 sea otters. The vessel then went to Hakodate, the treaty port in southwestern Hokkaido, and they processed this and sold the pelts. Other vessels soon followed suit. We know that at least 2 of those vessels had previously hunted in Alaska, but had been denied access after 1870 because of the monopoly established by the ACC. So after the RAC disappeared, the result was not the autonomy of the indigenous peoples and the Kurils, but the influx of other hunters, as well as the often confused Japanese officials. Between 1873 and 74, in the southern Kurils, foreign hunters and Japanese patrol officials engaged in improvised and confused negotiations and conversations with each other over the legality of state power and the legality of hunting. They argued with each other what the terms were to apply. The Japanese side, having studied what they considered the standard international law book of the time, argued that sovereignty over the coastal waters within 3 miles from the coast is the rule. The hunters deflected their demand by saying that they were hunting outside this 3-mile radius, or simply denied the applicability of such a rule. The Japanese side, unable to enforce anything, had to be content with simply getting a piece of writing like this one from the captain saying that he would not return. But of course they returned and hunted more animals. All this meant that while the Russo-Japanese boundary negotiations over Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands were underway, the mode of human mobility and interactions around the Kuril Islands had entered a new phase. The Russian agents disappeared, and instead, mostly American vessels with diverse crews occupied the center stage. Ainu and Aleut hunters had no choice but to trade with these hunting vessels, and Meiji officials struggled to deal with the hunters around Iturup, where, despite being the end of the northeastern Japan, no border control mechanism was in place. It was against this backdrop that Meiji Japan embarked on a path different from the exploitation of indigenous labor exercised by the Russians and Americans across the North Pacific. Having acquired the entire Kuril archipelago in 1875 as a result of the diplomatic negotiations in the Russian capital, the Meiji state linked Kuril's political administration to that of Hokkaido, essentially treating Kurils as an extension of Hokkaido in terms of administration. So it was the job of the Kaitakushi, or Hokkaido Colonization Office, headed by a man named Kuroda Kiyotaka, to figure out what to do with these new territory. Kaitakushi had an immediate and practical concern. How do we finance this administration? Where do we find money? Because the budget for running Hokkaido was already fixed. So it was natural for them to seek to make Kurils self-sufficient. Any policy options needed to pass this reality check. The Kaitakushi considered 2 options. One was to follow the previous example of the Russian-American company, and grant exclusive hunting rights to the private company, which would, for their own interest, ensure that no other party breached the border and interrupted their business. In other words, Japan could treat Kuriles as an overseas colony and continue to rely on indigenous labor, just as Russia and the United States were doing in the region. The second approach was to suppress foreign hunters based on international law and then encourage Japanese hunting enterprise. This approach would require Japanese settlement and potentially developing other industries than hunting. In essence, this would mean extending Hokkaido's administration to the Kuriles, treating it as part of the Japanese mainland. A majority of the opinions in and outside the government supported the first option. Given the Kaitakushi's limited budget and the logistical difficulty, some saw it as a only natural conclusion. Outside Japan, there was no shortage of takers who would gladly sign the contract to do the hunting here if the Kaitakushi decided to offer it. In the spring of 1875, even before the signing of the treaty, the Japanese representative there, Enomoto Takeaki, was approached by an American merchant saying that he's interested in leasing one island in this archipelago if Japan ended up owning it. One American officer in Washington, D.C. privately advised a Japanese diplomat that signing a lease would be economically more viable than enforcing border control at its own cost. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, in the winter of 1875, Henry Snow, a Yokohama-based British merchant who was active in the Kuriles since 1873, discussed his potential employment by the Kaitakushi to engage in animal hunting. But Kaitakushi chose the second approach. It chose not to sell the lease to the highest bidder or to appoint a foreign agent. It encouraged the Japanese to engage in fishery and animal hunting by granting a tax break of 5 to 10 years. There were two reasons behind this. One was the perceived necessity for the Meiji government to claim its quote-unquote civilized character through the administration of peripheral regions and also the rule over non-Japanese populations. And the other was this reservation against allowing foreigners to play any role in the management of the border regions. Despite the interest expressed by foreign merchants and hunters, the Japanese stuck with the development of the Kuriles as a national project. But attracting Japanese settlers to the Kuriles proved difficult, and the Japanese marine animal hunting business never took off the ground. The result was disastrous to the ecosystem of the Kuril Islands. Foreign hunters first took the sea otters to the point of near extinction, and from the mid-1880s onwards, they switched to their target to seals. And I will come back to this point later. Now on to the Ainu residents, the second disappearances. During the fall of 1875, shortly after the signing of the treaty and the Japanese acquisition of the Kuril Islands, the Meiji officials made 2 round trips around the Kuril Islands to survey the land and also its people, and to announce that these islands are now Japanese territory. They found 92 Aleuts and 72 Ainu. And earlier that year, the treaty stipulated that the indigenous peoples were to choose either to stay as Japanese or to leave to Russia and become Russian subject. The Aleuts, who had been originally brought in by the Russians, chose to leave. And this is the drawing of the Aleuts. Over here, the black figures waving their hats and saying goodbye, while the Japanese flag is being hoisted as a symbol of the Japanese rule. And the Ainu were eventually to stay, but that wasn't really a conclusion easily. The conclusion wasn't really easy to come to, as we will see. About a year later, in July 1876, the Kaitakushi officials appeared again in Shimushu, the northernmost island, and asked the Ainu residents whether they had made a decision about whether to stay or not. The chief of the village was named Keprian, and his brother was named Konkamakuru, and they were in charge, these guys. They told the Japanese that the question of belonging had not been decided among them, saying that they were still waiting for others to gather in Shimushu. After the Japanese left, before the winter set in, the Kuril Ainu in Shimushu split into two groups. The first group, led by Konkamakuru, the guy on the right, departed on the long journey southwards, presumably in search of fur animals, while the second group stayed in Shimushu, at least for the time being. Konkamakuru's group gradually moved southwards and spent the winter of 1881 in two islands in the middle of the Kuril Islands. And in 1882, in May, he and his group saw the arrival of 5 hunting ships. And this encounter turned out to be decisive. The ships were sailing under American, British, and Danish flags, or arriving via Yokohama. The ship's captains together plotted to steal the belongings of the Ainu, especially they were after salt barrels. And this was used to preserve the fur skins so that it won't go bad until it gets properly processed. In the version of the story presented to the Yokohama court in the following year, the plot went as follows. A Japanese laborer named Akiyama Sadajiro disguised himself as a Japanese official and erected a wooden signpost that announced in English and Japanese that the island belonged to the Nemuro prefecture of Japan. Akiyama then told the Ainu that they will be expelled by his colleagues who were to arrive soon because they were Russian subjects living in the Japanese island. If they wanted, Akiyama continued, he could transport them to the islands northward. The Ainu agreed and boarded 2 of the 5 ships, taking their possessions, and having successfully expelled or removed the Ainu, the captains of the remaining ships divided 70 to 80 salt barrels among themselves. The news arrived in mainland Japan, where the officials thought this was a serious and potentially dangerous development. The governor of Nemuro Prefecture, Yuichi Sadamoto, heard the news in Tokyo and hurried back to Hokkaido in the spring of 1883. Nemuro, on the eastern coast of Hokkaido, facing the Kuril Islands, had inherited the administration of the Kurils after the dissolution of the Hokkaido Colonization Office, the Kaitakushi. So Yuichi, this person, was essentially in charge of the Kurils policy. Now, looking at the records left by the Nemuro Prefecture, the Japanese police apparently had no interest in the theft of the salt barrels or even poaching of the animals. Instead, what they saw as a problem was this unauthorized and uncontrollable interaction between the foreign visitors and the Kuril Ainu residents. The Japanese government, so the story went, had no way of preventing this kind of interaction in the future, and this was posing a threat to the Japanese territorial integrity. With that, Yuichi decided that he himself needed to go to the Kurils and investigate the situation. Meanwhile, having left Akiyama's ship, Konkamakuru's group continued their northward trip and returned to Shimushu, the northernmost island, in early 1883. It is very difficult to clearly account for the reasons for all these movements, but we have to wonder whether we really believe whether he took Akiyama's words at its face value, because Konkamakuru, the Ainu's chief, had been informed about the terms of the treaty at least twice, in 75 and 76, when he met the Japanese officials. So he would have understood Akiyama's story as lies. And this kind of manipulations, misinterpretations, and misinformation is really prevalent in the communication around these remote islands. And this I see as the recurring theme of the process of territorial demarcation around Japan in the late 19th century. By the summer of 1883, the entire community of the Kuril Ainu got reunited in Shimushu. Apart from Konkamakuru's group, that went south and came back. There was another group that had left Shimoshu for Petropavlovsk in the Kamchatka Peninsula. But after several years and several untimely deaths due to harsh living conditions, they too had returned. Now the Kuril Ainu had to make a difficult decision about their future. The Russian agents were gone, so there were less opportunities to trade, however poor the times were. The marine animal population had drastically declined. The foreign poachers who would come to Kurils are now more exploitative, and they were abusive. Moving to the Russian side ended badly, so that wasn't really an option. What to do? On July 1st, 1884, Konkamakura and other Ainu residents saw the arrival of Hakodate Maru, the Japanese ship. On board were Yuchi, the Nemuro governor, and 30-odd officials from different ministries. The ship's arrival itself may not have been surprising to the Ainu because Nemuro officers had been regularly bringing provisions, food, and other items in support of their livelihood every 3 years. And this was the year that that kind of provision was expected. Yet this turned out to be no ordinary visit. Several days after Hakodate Maru's arrival, all the Kuril Ainu found themselves on the same ship with everything they could carry. And this time they relocated to Shikotan Island at the southern end of the archipelago. The Meiji state banned Kuril Ainu's return, including temporary visits for hunting and fishing, thus uprooting them from their homeland and emptying the islands of permanent residents. The move proved to be disastrous for the Kuril Ainu, who suffered from diseases caused by a sudden change in climate and lifestyle, and their population almost halved in the period of 10 years. And in the book, I discuss this conversation between, the record of conversation between the Ainu and the Japanese that resulted in this relocation. Today, I don't have time to go into detail, but the essence of it is that the Japanese officials essentially concocted the story so that this man, Konkamakuru, was represented as in need of protection by the Japanese from abusive and exploitative foreign poachers. The Japanese officials urged them to relocate to somewhere close to Nemuro so that they could take better care of them. And according to some sources, the Ainu's initial decision was in fact to remain, at which point, again, some sources claim that the Japanese officials accused the Ainu of lying to them, and they forced the Ainu to board on the ship and leave the island. And then they arrived in Shimoshu Island 5 days later. This Shakotan Gulf became their new home. Recent scholarship has been critical of the move, calling it forced relocation and arguing that the Kuril Ainu's demise was caused by the Meiji state's denial of their lifestyle and its successive assimilation policies into the Japanese nationhood. It is beyond doubt that the relocation took place against the will of the many Kuril Ainu, and it contributed to the community's eventual destruction. Within the month of the Kuril Ainu's arrival, 8 children were taken to a primary school in Nemuro, where 2 died before the rest returned in the following year. It is thus impossible to absolve the Japanese of the disastrous impact of the assimilation process. These are the buildings or the residence that they built in their new home in Shikotan. That said, the context ran deeper than what happened in that month of July 1884. By then, the sea otters and seals were far more difficult to find than before because of the unchecked hunting by the foreign visitors and the Japanese government's lack of regulation. Furthermore, the Kuril Ainu knew that the alternatives, such as moving to the Russian side, would end badly. They would have debated all these options in the few years, on the few days in early July 1884 before boarding the Japanese ship. The Russian withdrawal from the Kuril Islands, the lack of support in Petropavlovsk in the Russian town. American vessels continued operations, and the Japanese decision to pursue the Kuril's development without foreign involvement altogether narrowed the path for the Kuril Island. Finally, on to the disappearance of the marine animals. By removing the Kuril Island from the archipelago and banning their return, the Meiji state left the islands north of Ryukyu void of permanent residents. It became an unmanned territory, open to the continued onslaught of fur animals by foreign, mostly American vessels. By 1879, the sea otter population had plummeted to such an extent that one American shipowner predicted extinction in a few years' time. The hunters then targeted seals, which they still found in somewhat larger numbers, but their future was as grim as that of the sea otters. And in the beginning of the 1880s, there were approximately 22,000 seals in the entire archipelago. The total number of seals killed between 1881 and 1896 is believed to be around 25,000, thus outpacing the animal's reproduction, and thus emptying the rookeries like this one. In 1896, the investigators concluded that scarcely more than 30 existed in the entire island chain. There are photographs of only a few animals on Srednoy flat rocks in the middle of the island chain, once a major breeding site, illustrated the dramatic ecological impact in the last few decades. The accelerated hunting of fur-bearing animals was accompanied by the Meiji state's indifference toward nurturing its own hunting industry and ensuring its sustainability. The Japanese catch was never more than a fifth of that of the non-Japanese throughout this period. An American zoologist, Leonard Steinegger, investigated the fur animal population in the Kuril Islands in the late 1890s and accused the Japanese of their apparent incompetence in maintaining the animal's population. He did understand that the Japanese refused foreign lease because of what he called Japan for Japanese principle. But there was more than just nationalistic sentiment. From the perspective of the Meiji state, the Kuril Islands had to be different from a colony, and it had to be Japanese. In their mind, an intrusion of foreigners into one border region would set an example for others to follow, potentially destabilizing the Japanese territorial integrity. Even in the 1880s, the appointment of a foreign administrator in the border region would have been too inviting for European and American governments and businesses to seek similar projects elsewhere. Therefore, the Meiji government consistently sought to exclude foreigners from discussions of Japan's border administration. Where Steinegger saw ineffective utilization of maritime resources, the Japanese government officials saw a dispensable non-project in the interest of the state's survival. Borders around the Kuril Islands were constructed in this kind of fluid, ad hoc manner on the basis of malleable narratives. Foreigners' entry into the Kuril Islands went unchecked throughout the last quarter of the century, and legally agreed upon border between Shimoshu and the Kamchatka Peninsula was crossed without state oversight, much like the other end of the Japanese state between Ryukyu and Taiwan or South China. The unambiguously defined territorial border that are often assumed in existing scholarship never quite existed in practice in the Kuril Islands in the late 19th century. For over a decade, Meiji officials agonized over their incapacity to regulate the Kuril Islands' contact with foreign ships and their crew. Eventually, the Japanese gave up on the idea of extending the development policies in Hokkaido to the Kurils and found what can be called a cosmetic response, which is to empty the islands so that there won't be any interaction between the Kuril Island and the foreigners. Losing the economic opportunity of marine animal hunting was a price to be paid for making sure that the chipping away of Japanese remote islands did not ensue. The Kuril Islands became the nation's northeastern border, where the mode of boundary demarcation was defined by the removal of local population, as opposed to a more commonly practiced conventional approach of settling people, bringing people in, and having some substantive activities. The emptied archipelago, a creation of 3 decades of work, served the function of demarcating Japan in terms of geography and human mobility from Russia and also the United States. This is the last slide. So that's chapter 4, and I would like to conclude by saying a few words about what I see as the implication of the book's arguments. In hindsight, the process of demarcating or defining boundaries under the new legal principles of international relations provided the modern Japanese state a foundation in which to build a colonial empire across Asia and the Pacific in the following decades. It was a highly contingent process, however, deeply affected by events in faraway places, such as the US purchase of Alaska, to give one example. Secondly, the analytical lens of territorial disputes that we tend to use in looking at these remote islands makes us overlook the other actors than contenders for formal territorial sovereignty. It wasn't just the Japanese mainlanders whose actions nudged the nation towards this kind of future. Japan's borders were created by the Japanese, Russians, Chinese, Koreans, but also the Ryukyuans, Ainu, Irish Americans, and even non-human beings, such as the sea otters and seals. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.